Welcome to one of the most exciting games in chess history, played by two giants of the game, Bobby Fischer and Tigran Petrosian. And this game is so incredible. At one point, there are four queens on the board. To see that with the best players in the world is really rare. This is a really fun game. Bobby Fischer has white, Petrosian has black. This was played in the Candidates in 1959. Let us jump right in. Bobby Fischer begins with e4, and Petrosian responds with a Caro-Kann. Fischer responds with what's known as the two knights system. He doesn't play d4, but just gets his knights out, and Petrosian plays bishop to g4. So black's general strategy here is to trade off his light squared bishop and then create a light squared wall of pawns. So he's only left with his good bishop, the dark squared bishop that is at f8. h3, bishop is traded for the knight. The queen comes in, knight to f6, d3, and e6. And we see that light squared wall of pawns to compensate for the absence of the light squared bishop. g3 to fianchetto. g2. Obviously, this bishop also faces a pawn in its own way. Now, bishop to b4. What Petrosian wants to do is play d4, trying to take advantage of this pinned knight and gain some space. Fischer plays bishop to d2 to remove the pin, but then d4 anyway, gaining space in the middle of the board. Fischer plays knight to b1. After bishop takes d2 check, knight takes d2, and e5. And we see after bishop to g2 from Bobby Fischer, what we have here basically is a King's Indian Mar del Plata system in reverse. And Bobby Fischer was an expert at playing the King's Indian, so he's very comfortable with this position with white. And Petrosian was a King's Indian killer, so he's actually very happy with the position he has with black. This is comfortable territory for both. c5 is played, and we know the main strategy here. Black wants to play eventually c4 and break on this square and create a weakness on d3 and penetrate on the c file. White wants to play f4 and attack on the king side. So white castles, knight to c6, queen to e2 to get out of the way of the f-pawn so he can play f4, and queen to e7 from Petrosian. He does not commit to castling short. He can castle on either side of the board. After Bobby Fischer plays f4, he does not castle short, where white would have a ready-made attack advancing his pawns, but instead Petrosian castles long. So now the space advantage white has on the king side cannot be used for an attack, but that doesn't stop Fischer from creating an attack on the queen side. He plays a3 with the idea of playing b4 to open up lines, hopefully opening up the a and the b file. Knight to e8. The knight aims for d6. Now this pawn can go to f6 to create a stronger pawn chain. The knight at d6 might be able to support a c4 push. But Fischer plays b4. Pawn takes. And here, Fischer plays knight to c4. Maybe just going ahead and taking the pawn was as good or better. But this knight is on a good square, and Fischer would love to have these two open, these A and B files to work on to attack black's king. Petrosian plays f6. Fischer takes on e5. So now there's a target here with this pawn, and the f file is open. Then he goes ahead and takes on b4. And we can see Fischer is creating quite a bit of pressure here. He's threatening b5, which would dislodge this knight, leave the a7 pawn hanging. He's also applying pressure to the e5 pawn. And black does not want to take the pawn because then this rook would just move to b1 and he'd just have all kinds of pressure on the queen side. So what Petrosian does instead is he plays knight to c7. This knight controls the b5 square, and on b5 it would help defend a7. So Fischer plays knight to a5, trying to remove the defender, the knight at c6, knight to b5 from Petrosian. So he's defending a7, and he could even hop into the c3 square with that knight. Fischer goes ahead and takes that knight off, and at the very least, the queenside pawn structure for black is broken up a little bit. Rook to f2, maybe wanting to double on the f file. g6 to keep a rook out of the f5 square. h4, opening up a path for this bishop to go to h3, its best diagonal. The king goes to b7, h5, and a bit of a risky move, I suppose, trying to open things up on the king side Maybe just doubling rooks would have been better, but Petrosian goes ahead and takes on b4. He has confidence that even with these open A and B files, he'll be able to defend his king. And he has a very important trump now. He's got this A pawn, which is passed and could cause a lot of trouble marching up the board if white is not careful. Rook to f7 check, king goes up to b6, queen to f2. Now in this position, Fischer has a nasty little threat. He's threatening to play c4 here, which would dislodge this knight on b5 if it were white's move and he played c4. Notice black cannot take en passant because that would put his own king in check. That was the idea behind the queen to f2 move. So now c4 can be played. Black would not be able to take it, and the knight would be dislodged. Black plays a5, getting that pawn moving and allowing the move c4, which Fischer does play, and that knight goes to c3. So the knight is aggressively posted and is in a good position to assist the a pawn. Rook to f1, tripling on the f file. a4, the dangerous pawn advances. But Fischer has a lot of aggressive pieces on the king side. He plays queen to f6, threatening to just chop off that pawn at e5. And here Petrosian plays queen to c5. Maybe not the most exact move. The most precise was probably queen to d6, because that would stop what Bobby Fischer plays next. After queen to c5, Fischer plays this move, rook takes h7, which would not work if the queen were on d6. And the problem, of course, for black is if he takes the rook, then queen takes d8 check, and white is just better in this position. So Petrosian has to just accept the loss of that pawn. He plays rook d to f8, putting pressure down the f file. Now queen takes g6, and Fischer has a pretty strong pawn of his own, and these two pawns, the a pawn and the h pawn, are going to be in a bit of a race. Rook takes f1 check, bishop takes f1, rook h7, queen h7. And now the race begins. Fischer's problem is that his queen is in the way of the pawn, but it turns out not to be that big of a problem. a3 from black, h6, a2, queen to g8, and black queens first. And Fischer's 2 moves away from queening, but black just can't do anything with the queens to stop Fischer's queening of the h-pawn. So h7, queen to d6, and h8 queen. And we have 4 queens on the board. And so there are a lot of threats that can emerge here. Both kings are exposed, but Petrosian's king looks a little more exposed. One thing I want you to take note of is how brilliantly Petrosian uses his king, how he's able to use it aggressively. Even in a position like this, where his opponent has 2 queens, he's still able to use his king aggressively. Really, really impressive. So queen to a7 from black, g4 from Fischer. An interesting move. He's willing to give his king a little more air. Of course, he figures this pawn is, that's his extra material, so any chance of winning would be to advance that pawn, but it's very dangerous. King to c5 from Petrosian. Now queen to f8, willing to exchange one of the queens. Petrosian plays the other queen to e7, and here Fischer does not trade the queens, but instead plays queen to a8. And now the mate threats begin to develop. Queen to a3 check is very dangerous for black. So how does black deal with it? King to b4. So he's playing aggressively with his king and keeping the queen out of these squares, but doing so with his king. The queen comes back to h2, obviously threatening queen to b2 check, which would be a bad deal for black. So how does he deal with it? King to b3. He uses his king to control the entry square for Fischer's queen. Now queen to a1, and white is threatening mate with queen to b2. Queen to b2 mate is on the board, so Petrosian plays queen to a3 to trade off a pair of queens. Queen takes, king takes, queen to h6, attacking the pawn at c6, queen to f7, threatening to come into f4 where he has an attack on the g4 pawn. He can check at g3 or e3. A king to g2 to keep the queen out. If instead queen takes c6, then queen to f4 gives black enough counterplay to be in good shape. So king to g2 keeps the queen out of f3. King to b3, And now queen to d2, bringing that queen back, queen to h7, and king to g3. And in this position, which is essentially equal or close to equal, black comes up with a neat little tactic to deal with his problems. He plays this move, queen takes e4. And that does not just lose a queen. Obviously, the pawn can just take the queen. But if white does that, then knight takes e4 check with an attack on the king and the queen, and black is just better here. He's up a pawn, and he'd get his material back up a pawn. So instead of that, Fischer plays queen to f2, and then after queen to h1, Petrosian agreed to a draw in this position. It's pretty much come to be agreed upon that Petrosian with black is a little better here, but he goes ahead and accepted the draw because people assumed he was under so much pressure with all of those mating threats with the two queens. He just said, okay, let's call it a day. And there was a draw. Queen to f3 would lead to a fairly equal position anyway. A really wild game between two legendary players. I hope you've enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.